Good evening. Welcome. I'm Ann Thompson, the Assistant Director for Public Services at the Essex Library, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this first event in our climate change and income inequality discussions. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. While you are joining us, please go ahead and keep your microphones muted and your cameras off. And as the presentation starts with Dr. Ouimet, go ahead and please put your questions in the chat as you think of them, and we'll get to them after the talk. As a bit of introduction to this event and the others that will follow, in 2020, the Essex Library was one of 200 libraries across the country selected to receive a grant in the first round of the American Library Association's Libraries Transforming Communities program. The grant enables libraries to address issues of concern to their community. We directed our efforts to raising awareness of income inequality in the community. In the third round of the ALA funding in 2021, Essex Library was one of 50 returning libraries to be awarded an LTC grant, allowing us to continue efforts in raising awareness of income inequality with the extended focus on climate change and how it influences income inequality. Here's why. Between 2018 and 2020, the percentage of asset-limited, income-constrained, employed, otherwise referred to with the acronym ALICE households, and households living below the poverty line, as measured by the United Way, grew by 8% in the town of Essex. According to Connecticut Data Collaborative Community Economic Resource Center's 2021 profile of Essex, 5%, or about 330 people, are estimated to live in poverty. According to the 2020 United Way ALICE report for Connecticut mentioned earlier, 33% of Essex residents are living at or under the ALICE threshold income level. That's over 2,000 people. And by the way, well above the average for Middlesex County. That in itself is sufficiently compelling to make mitigating the disparity a continued service priority for the Essex Library. But there's more. In just 13 months between August 2020 and September 2021, Connecticut was battered by 3 tropical storms, causing multi-day power outages and significant flooding, putting even more strain on disadvantaged households in the community. At the library, we asked ourselves, what can we do to help? We responded by offering outdoor charging stations and a library of things that included items like a solar-powered battery charging mat, toolkits, Wi-Fi hotspots, and Chromebook laptops. We want to do more, but we want to know what would be most helpful for the folks in need. Enter Dr. Eleanor Ouimet, an environmental anthropologist currently teaching in the University of Connecticut's anthropology department. Her research focuses on human-environment interactions, cross-cultural conservation practices, community response to natural hazards, and the effects of climate change. She also explores the links between culture, history, economics, environmental ethics, and resource management. Her talk tonight will discuss ongoing research efforts to understand the underlying drivers of the risks posed by climate change to disadvantaged community members and the diversity of disaster experiences among different sectors of the community. She will also cover ideas to engage residents, emergency planners, and policymakers in equitable community-based disaster preparedness and resilience building initiatives. Welcome, Dr. Ouimet.
Hello, thank you for having me. I will go ahead and share my screen and then hopefully everything will set up smoothly after that. Okay, does that look good, Ann?
Yes, you're good.
Okay. Okay, so thank you, Ann, for that introduction. As Ann mentioned, the talk today is going to talk about storms of inequity, looking at community risk response, repair, and resilience in the face of climate change-induced disasters in Connecticut. So I'll skip over this part and I'll go right into what I really want to talk about today, which is I want to start by looking a little bit at environmental anthropology as a field and its contributions to the study of disaster response, recovery, and resilience. I'll address a bit about the climate change projections for this region and what it may mean for preparedness of the population. And I'll share with you some of the work that I'm currently involved in to identify what I'm calling eco-social structural vulnerability and its relevance to addressing issues of inequity and injustice in the history of disaster response and recovery efforts. And finally, I'll end with a discussion of some of the steps forwards towards holistic disaster recovery, preemptive action, and the effective interdisciplinary efforts to build a system of preemptively addressing vulnerability to enhance resilience. So if we start with a brief look at environmental anthropology as a subdiscipline, we can think of environmental anthropology as a subfield that examines the way in which a particular population of people purposefully or unintentionally shapes its environment and the ways its relations with the environment shape its culture and its social, economic, and political life. The subfield's most pressing issues are those pertaining to environmental justice and the ways in which members of disadvantaged ethnic, minority, or other groups suffer disproportionately at the local, regional, or national levels from environmental risks or hazards and from violations of fundamental human rights as a result of environmental factors. Environmental anthropology attempts to recognize and pay really careful attention to the multiplicity of players in every environment and to be closely involved in global efforts to unearth and remedy injustice and to understand and disentangle the root causes of environmental damage and ultimately to understand, define, and implement environmental responsibilities. So before we really get started into the meat of things, I would like to go over a couple key terms that I'll be using throughout the talk. And there's inconsistencies in the way some of these terms are used and thought about and their meaning and implications in this discussion. So for instance, if we talk about risk, right, this is something that anthropologists consider to be far less quantifiable than, say, engineers. I do a lot of work with engineering colleagues, and we spend a lot of time just actually debating some of these concepts and what they mean. This definition, right, this combination of the magnitude of the potential consequences of climate change and the likelihood that the consequences will occur, right, is really implies a calculable determination as to whether something or someone is at risk. But it ignores a lot of what I'll be talking about today, which is that underlying historical, sociocultural, and oftentimes economic issues that lead to disparity in how individuals or entire communities are impacted by the consequences of a hazard. So then if we talk about resilience, right? And this is commonly thought about as that bounce back ability, right? If we have resilience, it means we can bounce right back to normal. But as we're going to talk about today, risk and vulnerability are often influenced by a priori conditions, right? Histories of discrimination and wealth disparities that make bouncing back to normal far less ideal than moving forward towards a stronger state of preparedness. When I'm talking about resilience with my students, I'll often bring up the example of Hurricane Katrina, and the notion of going back to normal was really the idea of going back to a condition of extreme segregation and disparity and discrimination, right? That's not strengthening anybody, right? That normal is vulnerable, right? So when we talk about resilience, we're really talking about moving forward. Vulnerability, right? The inability to absorb, cope, or sustain change to a predictable aspect of a system that's fairly consistent. But we do sometimes have confusion over the notion of hazard versus disaster. When we're talking about hazard, we're really talking about a force of nature, right? Now, oftentimes when we're talking about climate change, we are talking about a human-induced force of nature, right? It can also include an accident or a tragedy. Disaster culminates from the collision of hazards and vulnerability. Unlike hazards, they're not inevitable. Disasters are not inevitable, right? They can be dampened and their impacts can be dampened and less severe through attention, preemptive attention to issues of equity and justice and preparedness. Also, when we talk about weather and climate, right? Climate is what we expect, weather is what we get, right? Just a pithy quote from, I think it's a science fiction author, Robert Heinlein. But that really frames the difference between weather and climate, right? Climate is that average long-term condition, and weather is that specific short-term condition that can vary quite dramatically day to day. We all are very familiar with that in Connecticut. So I want to talk a little bit about climate change projections in Connecticut specifically. And when we think about Connecticut, in comparison to the hazards that characterize other regions of the United States, right, such as the wildfires and drought in the West, tornadoes in the Midwest, hurricanes and coastal storms in the Southeast, New England has historically been perceived as free, relatively free from natural hazards and disasters other than snowfall. However, increasingly destructive weather events and damaging heat waves, hurricanes, flooding, nor'easters, tornadoes, and damaging winds indicate that southern New England is under heightened threat from frequent and severe weather events attributable to human-induced climate change. In fact, research indicates that New England is in fact warming faster than the world as a whole, and posits that the region is close to surpassing the 2 degrees Celsius mark warned against in the 2021 IPCC report. The northeastern United States is actually warming faster than any other region in the lower 48, and this is especially true for the winter season, which has warmed 3 times faster than summers have. By 2035, it's predicted that the Northeast is expected to be about 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit warmer on average than it was before the Industrial Revolution. This region is also among the top 3 areas in the United States at risk for billion-dollar winter storms associated with more frequent nor'easter events. And compared to the rest of the United States, scientists observe some of the highest rates of sea level and ocean warming off the New England coast. And that's expected to stay true and increase throughout the rest of this century. We also see that southern New England particularly faces ever-increasing hurricane risks as the climate change-induced weakening of the high-pressure zone off the mid-Atlantic coast is actually causing hurricane activity to push northward, pretty on a direct trajectory with Connecticut. So between 1980 and 2021, there have been 35 major weather-related disaster events in Connecticut, and 19 of these storm events have occurred in the last decade. These 19 events alone have cost over $30 billion, and they've left hundreds of thousands of residents without power for days to weeks at a time. These emergencies are particularly dangerous to food-vulnerable residents living near or below the poverty line who are reliant on passable roads, reliable power, and public services for work, heating, cooling, school lunches, medical care, and protection. These statistics lie in really sharp contrast to the regional reputation of Connecticut, where the flagship university is located in Tolland County, renowned as America's best place to avoid death by natural disaster. Many of the small New England towns that comprise Connecticut and the surrounding New England states are subsequently unprepared to address the social, economic, and infrastructural challenges posed by the rise in severe weather events because they've never been perceived or conceived themselves as an area threatened by severe weather events. The changes in temperature and seasonality that scientists observe and predict have huge implications for New Englanders, for health, for safety, and for the economy. And that's because what we know is that just a few degrees can so dramatically impact stable systems that this can throw the ability of a vast portion of the population, right, their ability to cope out the window, right, because it completely changes the status quo. These risks underline the pressing need to better understand the potential for hazard-induced disaster scenarios and the implementation of preemptive preparedness and recovery practices, as well as community-engaged resilience strategies to ensure that this region can protect the long-term safety and well-being of its inhabitants. One of the very first things we need to do, of course, is to acknowledge that there is no such thing as natural disasters. Disasters are living events with social and ecological contexts, causes, losses, and long-term repercussions. Indeed, as we talked about and with the key terms, there are hazard events, earthquakes, tornadoes, fires, floods, that no science can fully control or predict. But it's understood that hazards do not inevitably result in a disaster. Anthony Oliver Smith, a well-known disaster anthropologist, has famously stated that disasters are not accidents or acts of God. They are deeply rooted in the social, economic, and environmental history of the societies where they occur. Moreover, disasters are far from catastrophic events. They are processes that unfold through time, and their causes are deeply embedded in societal history. In effect, a disaster is made inevitable by the historically produced pattern of vulnerability, evidenced in the location, infrastructure, socio-political structure, production patterns, and ideology that characterizes a society. As Anne was talking about in the introduction to the talk, in the state of Connecticut, approximately 11% of residents live under the poverty line. Over 27% of households qualify as ALICE. That number is higher in Essex. And 47% of seniors, 57% of Black households, and 63% of Hispanic households live under the ALICE threshold. Compounding these statistics is the reality that small, quintessential New England towns in Connecticut, whose historic influence hides rampant economic inequality, lack full-time social services programs, food banks, shelters, or the infrastructure to provide adequate support to growing populations of vulnerable residents. In order to design truly effective preemptive action to not only address the loss, to prevent loss of life, but to increase resilience and well-being, we must understand the ways in which communities perceive their relationship to the environment and to respond to hazard risk. We must understand the systems on which individuals and entire communities depend and connect and prepare them to service those most in need. Furthermore, we must understand how individual responses to risk vary and how entire communities rank the consequences of disaster differently depending on factors such as prior experience, trust in local authorities, access to information, environmental perceptions, risk aversion, and cultural value systems. These details are pivotal to clarifying the reasons why some communities may or may not choose to invest in community level preparedness, or what are their factors impeding their ability to do so. The risks to local communities posed by the disconnect between economic vulnerability and the unavailability of social services plays out against this backdrop of increasingly severe and frequent weather events due to climate change. Disaster anthropologists have argued that the longer social factors are perceived as having little or nothing to do with peril and disaster, the more the social construction of both will unfurl. So in the research that I'm conducting with the disaster research team at UConn, we conceptualize the environment as consisting of 3 layered domains, each of which is conventionally studied and understood by different academic disciplines. The physical environment is the raw, unaltered terrain of the earth and its biological inhabitants. The structural environment consists of all the changes made to the physical environment by human activities, including altering the terrain itself and building on it. And the cultural environment is the adaptive guide for human activity. It includes human knowledge and perception, norms of behavior, communication, and modes of production. This research is premised on the theory that the transition from hazard to disaster is most likely to occur when vulnerability in these 3 areas is overlapping, disaster severity increasing as the vulnerability of each sector increases. The 3 areas of vulnerability include potential hazard exposure, infrastructural risk, and sociocultural inequity, right? For example, racial inequality, economic inequality, lack of support networks, previous disaster experience, civic engagement, etc. We refer to this system as eco-social structural vulnerability. And we assume that those communities at the greatest risk for hazard-induced disasters are not simply those with the greatest potential for exposure to a hazard event, but rather those with pre-existing sociocultural and infrastructural vulnerabilities resulting from economic and race-based inequities, low levels of support, and poor resilience indicators from previous hazard events. In the examination of resilience from previous events and subsequent preparedness, we should be reminded of this work by Mendez with migrant workers during the California wildfires in 2017, from which it was deduced that every part of a disaster is to some extent, including the vulnerabilities, preparedness, response, and rebuilding, is to some extent a social calculus. It follows that the question of who fully recovers is also embedded in human decisions that prioritize some lives over others. Across the disciplines engaged in climate change and disaster science, there is finally a marked acknowledgement that the history of disaster response and recovery, from information dispersal to insurance compensation, has and continues to privilege affluent, predominantly white communities while discriminating against and contributing to the social and economic marginalization and geographic vulnerability of more impoverished communities and communities of color around the world. Unlike hazards, disasters unfold upon a social topography where they flow through channels carved by the history of inequality. Like rivers, they rage the loudest where discrimination has cut the deepest swath for the longest time. And they hit hardest those communities and individuals who are historically the least heard, the least culpable, and those made the most vulnerable by the recurring flood of racial and economic subjugation. For historically marginalized communities, communities of color, and impoverished communities, survival is becoming increasingly difficult, despite increased attention to disaster risk reduction. But also pressing, and especially in the Connecticut context, is the fact that a dominant focus on preventing loss of life from disasters tends to neglect the long-term, day-to-day, and recurring socioeconomic impacts of disasters on those who live to die another day. What we're seeing is that the increasing frequency and severity of disasters due to climate change and the ways in which the impacts of climate change exacerbate the stressors caused by the spread of epidemics and the intersectional assaults lodged by economic hardship and systemic racism, and lack of institutional support in education, healthcare, food access, and basic needs, is leaving entire communities even more vulnerable to future shocks. In short, we are seeing that resilience is decreasing. Mendez et al. In their work with the California migrant workers mobilizes this notion of contextual vulnerability to explain the juxtaposition of slow violence that environmental injustice impinges upon poor communities and communities of color over the course of decades, and the effects of fast-moving dramatic disasters such as wildfires, hurricanes, floods, long-term power outages, etc. Perhaps most salient to this discussion is the fact that slow violence is considered in large part to be invisible, unrecognized in the moment of disaster as a contributing factor that exacerbates the impacts of hazard events. This invisibility, particularly to those in power, leads many to see disaster events as inevitable results of hazards rather than as a byproduct of environmental injustice triggered by a hazard. Mendez has talked about the way in which, in some cases, individuals or groups are treated as unworthy victims whose plight, exacerbated by social and environmental injustices, are less deserving of assistance and attention, or are in some cases whose fate is part and parcel of what they signed up for. In his case, when his research in terms of whether or not what they signed up for in coming to this country and his work with migrant workers. In other cases, we see officials misunderstanding or uninformed about the myriad reasons why an individual or a community may not heed evacuation orders or respond to warnings from emergency managers after years of learning that local authorities may not prioritize their needs, interests, or well-being. A recent New York Times article further outlines how slow violence continues and recurs in the aftermath and rebuilding stages of response and recovery, as poor and predominantly Black homeowners regularly receive significantly less compensation than white affluent counterparts for the same degree of damage from insurance companies. And communities of color regularly see their housing values decline following rebuilding efforts, while white communities often see tremendous increases in housing value. The same article goes on to make the point that, and I quote, "These aren't intentionally discriminatory practices, but they are," right? Those of us that work and are invested in equitable and effective disaster response and recovery recognize that disasters and their aftermath are, in fact, the manifestation of slow violence and the cumulative social and environmental injustices that plague generations of the population, right? These injustices are not unintentional misfortunes. They are the results of devaluing and the dismissal of marginalized communities. So in the context of disaster, research indicates that around the world, individuals, communities, and entire social systems create, define, respond, and adapt to environmental hazards and the prospect of future disasters, not by objectively calculating risk, but guided by the knowledge, norms of behavior, and value systems that come from experience with both the natural and social environment. Most notably, their cumulative experience with loss, injustice, or lack thereof during previous disasters and interactions with decision makers. On the ground investigation, year in, year out, over long spells, interacting with people directly, right, increasingly has been shown to be the means of truly learning about a people's knowledge, needs, and axiomatic desires, as opposed to the imposition of top-down programs and superficial assumptions. And this is where anthropology really comes in. Anthropology contributes to the tools of mitigating disaster risk with its elemental methodology of ethnographic fieldwork. Right? Ethnographic methods and data include what we call participant observation, right? Long time interactions, living, working, playing, praying, eating with a community, focus groups, interviews, surveys, life history research, the collection of a wide range of data types, such as community histories, support networks, trusted sources of information, community leaders, prior disaster experiences, social organization and community institutions, racial, economic, and gender disparities, and most of all, right, the values, norms, and beliefs that guide individual and ultimately community behavior. Ethnographic data can increase the efficacy and equity of community-level disaster response by illuminating the slow violence wrought by social and environmental injustice. As we've seen, the cumulative impact of poverty, stress, food stress, racial discrimination leaves marginalized communities most vulnerable to hazard events, in large part due to infrastructural inequities and or excluded from and discriminated against during preparedness efforts, decision-making processes, and the distribution of essential information and resources during recovery. But as evidence also indicates, issues like trust, support networks, past experiences tell us a great deal about inequity and preparedness. For example, high levels of trust in authorities have been found to reduce risk perception, but in turn also reduce engagement in preparedness activities. Meanwhile, distrust in authorities, rooted in citizens' perceptions that the respective civil protection systems are not working effectively, has been linked to fatalistic attitudes, which also hamper disaster preparedness. No longer can disaster response, recovery, and resilience efforts be concentrated on the mere management of emergencies post-event. We're far too aware of the important influence that communities, disparate vulnerabilities, and disparities have on the way disasters unfold. The failure to account for local dynamics can be economically devastating, even deadly for the survivors of disasters, as well as for those responding to the next disaster, and may lead to wasteful public health efforts and emergency aid and relief spending. Policies and practice simply must consider local culture. So anthropologists have a long history of contributing to the overall understanding of how and why disasters have the impacts that they do, and what the consequences of disasters can be. Disaster anthropologists have shown that disasters are the visible, explicit result of deeper and much more complex processes. For instance, the beliefs about the causes of disaster influence how empowered individuals and communities feel to prepare and respond to environmental change or hazards, what actions are seen to be appropriate to take or to prepare or respond to environmental change, and which hazards are perceived to be worthy of attention. However, the attention of the policy world continues to focus on emergency management and recovery processes rather than what impels vulnerability to begin with. And the current applied interdisciplinary disaster research, policy, and preventive efforts really lack community-specific ethnographic data from which to base culturally appropriate and effective preemptive actions that can increase preparedness, enhance community resilience, and identify and engage cross-sector community members. There's a huge amount of research right now focusing on the geospatial mapping of social vulnerability coming from census data in urban environments. There is such a reliance on census data that we miss the idiosyncrasy, the nuance, the history, the culture, the individuality of particular settings, particular neighborhoods, particular communities. And we lose the individuals themselves, and we lose what truly drives action or inhibits action and the ability to take action. And so there's a big effort right now to move away from census-based data and to get into the community and to recognize that it's really going to be about engaging with community members, that you're going to be able to co-produce preparedness plans that will have staying power in a local setting. So we want to know who and what motivates decision-making in the midst of a disaster scenario. People do not flow like water, right? What do people need to move past the disaster with resilience, knowledge, and empowerment so that they are moving forward stronger and more prepared next time? We want to know what are the cultural lenses through which communities perceive their relationship to the environment and respond to hazard risk. How do these lenses influence the decision to take preemptive action? How do cultural value systems regarding the role of the individual or the value of an individual within a society influence individual decision-making and disaster response, as well as town level or city level decision-making and the way particular residents are treated and accounted for? Right? And how do prior disasters and the duration of time between disasters influence community response and preemptive preparation? So the social sciences have a long history of influencing, contributing to a broad understanding of cultural and human impacts of disaster. But much of that work tends to stay in the field until it gets incorporated into top-down messaging and possibly policy. At the community by community level, though, it's crucial that we get to work addressing how personal and communal experience with disasters and authorities, long-term inequity, and cultural values, behaviors, and beliefs influence risk perception, influence disaster response, recovery, and resilience. And one way that we approach this is through the integration of ethnographic data into interdisciplinary disaster research and applied projects. And specifically, I'm drawn to the incorporation of ethnographic data into what medical anthropologist, the late Paul Farmer, who just recently passed, calls the accompaniment approach. And the accompaniment approach rests on the well-demonstrated notion that the best aid strategies are those that prioritize the support of local capacities to deliver aid and improve livelihoods long-term. They're led by local partners, and they allow local level knowledge and experience and values to guide local policy. Ethnographic data collection and the accompaniment approach are well paired to inform policy and preparedness by revealing the yet untapped and long overlooked contributions that at-risk communities themselves have to make to long-term resilience building. Right? These community members are, after all, the individuals best equipped to reveal to disaster research teams and policymakers or local level emergency management where and why A, the next hazard may become a disaster, and B, the ways in which slow violence, right, wrought by the accumulation of top-down oversights, inequities, injustices, foment the transformation of natural hazards to disasters. The research that my team is working on now is to assess that overlapping eco-social structural vulnerability, to identify the areas and the community members with the greatest need and at the greatest risk, to work with them to facilitate trusted, effective modes of communication with institutions with the capacity to provide equitable support, such as public libraries, right? And to connect these community centers with state-of-the-art power outage prediction models to provide forewarning, resources, and preparedness to community members ahead of storm events. Outage forewarning doesn't alleviate all the risks of hazards by a long shot, but it can at least increase the rate at which community members can become informed and prepared and ever more ready for future events. This work is evolving as we speak. My team is collaborating with Anne and Deborah at the Essex Library Association on a grant proposal to examine some of these issues in Essex specifically. And I really welcome the opportunity to speak with individuals interested in forging a path forward towards improved and informed preparedness. One of the first steps that as researchers and as community members that we've taken at the beginning of this is to try to better understand and to understand what disaster experiences feel like and look like to others, both from the perspective of how different disciplines study disasters, right, in terms of anthropologists or ecologists or engineers, and how different community members with different burdens and life histories experience them. There's a rich history revealing the power of shared stories to break down boundaries, not just between disciplines, but even between authorities and residents, simply by telling personal stories in the same place. This is inspired by the efficacy of the co-production of knowledge between scientists and local community members around the world, largely in the work of conservation. And so we first started this work by collecting disaster stories. I started by asking my colleagues, especially those in engineering, to bear with me for a moment and to hear me out, because when I started saying, let's share stories, right, the engineers kind of bristled because it seemed really personal and overly subjective from their very quantitative perspective. But that was kind of the point. There are some researchers by the names of Moisey and Peak who present a really compelling argument for this power of sharing experience stories among colleagues engaged in interdisciplinary disaster research as a way to establish common ground that helps overcome disciplinary and institutional forces that might inhibit the consideration and communication of evidence, open-minded thinking, and translations that span disciplines and scholarly domains. They argue that at the nexus of disaster research, right, at the intersection of the natural, built, economic, and human systems, makes for a really promising area for introducing and testing the idea of using stories for interdisciplinary dialogue, especially for helping social scientists convey the relevance of their work to disaster science. And so in the spirit of this kind of nuanced conception that emphasizes mutual trust and respect between storyteller and listener, I've included a couple of the excerpts from our own stories here. And there's actually one in particular that I would like to share with you. And let me just kind of see if I can get there right here. So this is a story that a geographer that I work with named Chris Burton shared with me. And it's talking about his personal experience with the contextuality of social vulnerability in disaster spaces, as he describes finding himself a scholar of disaster vulnerability, right? Trained by the foremost name in social vulnerability, stuck in the midst of a flash flood in Italy, without language comprehension, a support network, or any source of reliable information. And I'll just read some of it to you, because I think I have a little bit of time for this one, right? It was raining, and it rained some more, and then it rained some more. It was a Saturday when I woke from an afternoon nap to the sound of heavy rain. Now, at this point, the latter was nothing new. However, I also woke to the sound of one alarm after another. Being a foreigner, I didn't recognize the alarms, and the sounds seemed to be getting more intense. At this point, I was visualizing some sort of flood Armageddon below my flat, a scene where the city below me was being swept away into floodwaters and alarms were going off everywhere. Pavia is at the confluence of two major rivers, and I was aware that catastrophic flooding was part of their history. I had no television to get the news, so I relied on the internet. Did I forget to mention that I didn't speak Italian at the time either? Even if I could get to the news via the internet, I couldn't understand it, and I had no friends that I could ask to help. Was the news I was looking at reliable? What if I needed to evacuate? Was I going to be able to understand instructions? Where would I go? To add insult to injury, I had nothing in my refrigerator due to my travels. I had no local bank account and no local currency in my pocket. US dollars and Chinese yuan wasn't going to cut it. I was the epitome of what I refer to as socially vulnerable. Social vulnerability is a concept in natural hazards and disaster research that can be defined as characteristics within social systems that create the potential for loss or harm. Social vulnerability often arises from inequalities and marginalizations within society. In my case, however, I was a scientist educated in this exact topic, invited to Italy to work on this topic, and arguably not marginalized. So how did I become one of Italy's most socially vulnerable? My circumstances on that day provided a timely lesson that I incorporate into my research on the topic to date. Context matters. What makes people vulnerable to a hazard such as a flood can be much different than what makes them vulnerable to other types of hazards such as drought. To this day, we measure social vulnerability without doing enough to account for context. And my work seeks to better understand those contextual drivers of social vulnerability by accounting for both hazard and social context. And that's really the essence of what it is that we're trying to do. And what we're trying to emphasize is that the social context matters not simply for recovering and what is the normal to return to. It matters because if we're going to build resilience, it has to be based on local level values, on local level norms, on local levels wishes and aspirations and success indicators. It has to be built on what people need and what people will be motivated to maintain and sustain. So right now, I'm working with Anne and Deborah at the Library Association to see if we can design a way to implement some of these community-engaged research efforts in Essex. And if it all comes to fruition, we may be sending out invitations for additional programming and focus groups and a survey for residents. In the meantime, I would love to invite, and I apologize for this pitch, but I would love to invite anyone who is interested in participating in these efforts with an experience, a concern, or even simply observations in the context of hazard and disaster response to contribute their own experiences with these events. All information is kept completely anonymous and confidential, but it does help to build a history of these issues and concerns and needs and context. And the ways in which different people in the community experience and see the same event differently can help considerably, especially as we approach ever greater hazard threats from climate change. And with that, I will wrap up and offer any questions.
Oh, thank you so much. It's such a an enormous amount of information to provide on what are emotional and frightening, but also inspiring and illuminating what potential we have as community members. I have a couple of questions, but there were, I got a few anyway, so I should go ahead and shout them out to you.
Should I stop sharing? Would that be helpful?
I'm sorry. Oh, no, you're fine. You can leave
Okay.
that up. Actually, if people can see your email address, or we can
Oh
share.
yeah, I can go back to that one.
Everybody afterwards. Yeah.
Yeah.
Enlightening, well-researched, informative, not qualified to critique, but it rings true, but feels daunting and complicated to solve. How do you choose what 3 real things to focus your energy on to help solve?
Yeah, it is daunting. And I think that how do you choose is, I would use it as a general U, right? A capital Y, because I think it can't be imposed from the outside, and I think it can't be imposed from the top down. I think it really needs to be a collaborative view, a collaborative group to recognize what are the particular threats to our community and to the fabric of our community, and how do we strengthen the group so that we can move forward stronger. And sometimes it requires a completely revamped approach to various elements of society or in a community. And sometimes it's small things here and there. But I think the changes can be stepwise. I think they can be shared at various levels. I mean, I'm a big believer in putting things as much as possible into school systems, and to keep that bottom up, right? Put that education as early as possible into the school systems. Put the hopes and the agency, right, with children and with the community members, because it is possible to make changes, and it is possible to make life much easier for a lot of people. But it takes cooperation and some preemptive thinking before things get awful, because it's a lot harder after the fact.
You bet. You bet. That's so right. So another question is, can the rural learn from the urban? I know you've had focused research in the Hartford area for one, but I'm guessing lots of other places that are more urban as well. Have the urban areas been able to address this sense of approaching the disaster relief in a way that the rural areas could learn from? Or is it, is there nothing to be learned from anybody at this point?
No, I think there's lots to be learned. And you know what, some of the urban areas, because of the high perceived need, right, have done a lot more. And oftentimes people assume that, oh, well, an affluent area is far better off. And actually, that's not necessarily true. Oftentimes you have rural affluent areas with what you're seeing, like what you've been talking about in Essex, with pockets of increasingly large vulnerable populations who are the worst off, because they do not have the resources or the attention that the urban environment does. And they may be in a small community that has never been perceived as at risk. The urban environments have had, in some of them, right, have had much more work in looking at how do you onboard, how do you get community level engagement, and how do you really make it matter? And it matters in a sense of making the discussions accessible, right? You can't hold discussions during a workday in one language with yes or no questions and no childcare, right? You need to make it far more accessible. You need to make it open to acknowledging and thinking about individual experiences. You need to make it so that people who want or should participate are incentivized, compensated to participate. So a lot of that has happened in urban areas. But like I said, there is a lot of the environmental justice work right now. Again, it happens in urban areas. And at this point, it's gone so far in that direction that a lot will argue that we have a real dearth of knowledge about the rural environments. And we have a severe lack of ethnographic information on the rural environments because there's so much done on the census-based approach to urban environments. So I think there is a lot to learn, but I think there's probably even more to learn at this point about, there might be more work to do in the urban environments, but there might be more to learn from the rural environments.
Got it. One of the benefits of Essex is it's not like Montana where you may have 600 people spread out over 6,000 miles, or, I'm exaggerating, but, you've got 6,000 people over a couple of square miles. So it can be, small in this case means that we can also be nimble. So there's real potential with, we don't have to fix childcare in the United States. Maybe we could just fix childcare in Essex, or feed our children in Essex without having to worry about the entire state of Connecticut, for instance. And I think the positive of Essex is that we kind of are at both ends of the wealth spectrum. There are a lot of very wealthy people in Essex, we know that, and there are also a lot of very not wealthy people in Essex. And we're a community of volunteers and a community of well-educated, heartfelt people who, I think, if the awareness was such that they understood how resilience could be triggered and uplifted, would step right in if they had a formula and knew how to do that. So I don't want this talk to leave anybody with a sense of despair or hopelessness, and I know you don't either. I think
no, not at all, because there are, like you said, there's so many things that, and even small things that people can do that they may not even realize has tremendous benefits. And so, yeah, no, I would absolutely agree with what you're just saying. I lost my train of thought where I was going with that. I mean, I had a conversation the other day with an engineer who was talking about power outages and talking about how hard it is to get people to tree trim because people don't want to cut their trees. And he said, but sometimes it would help if they just understood that you may have a big, beautiful, yard with a big, beautiful tree, but a little bit of trimming can go in a long way in helping those who will not be out of power if your tree falls, who can't be out of power because their paychecks are in the freezer, right? And so the small communities, like you said, they're adaptable and they're flexible, and they know one another, and it really, there's a lot of potential to work and to help each other.
Yeah, and my husband has a saying that he likes to use is "Don't let perfect get in the way of good." And I think you can do some real good in a small community in probably a pretty small amount of time, and it just takes getting some people banded together to understand how help can be rendered. So to that end, we have a question: how do you plan to get stories and data that intersect all populations of Essex? That is, people without internet access, those that are housebound, et cetera, et cetera.
That's going to be a challenge. And we're going to use various different approaches, right? We start off with a really broad, like that eco-social structural look, where we are going to do an ecological assessment of where are the areas of the greatest ecological risk, right? Floodplain, tree canopy, heat island, stuff like that. And then the infrastructural aspects that overlap largely with that in terms of transportation analysis, the overlap between ecologically risky areas and sort of evacuation routes and power outage and grid resilience. And then we start with that sort of just very broad brushed social vulnerability of where are, just, statistically speaking, where are the most vulnerable populations, right? And then we have to figure out, okay, how do we get the survey out, right? How do we use word of mouth? How do we use local authorities, libraries, social services, schools, Qualtrics, newspapers. Oftentimes it means that we're just sort of hanging around or putting word out in various places to get as many people to respond to a survey as possible. But then it also means going to the next level, right? And I'm someone that I don't do social vulnerability census data. And I do some survey, but not much. I actually am in like the long story form type research, right? I collect personal histories. I talk to people for long periods of time. We will be doing focus groups where we kind of bring people together, again, compensating food, childcare, etc. But the ultimate goal is to be able to have long conversations with people about their experiences, to encourage them to share, to encourage people to get into one space, COVID allowing, to really kind of contrast and compare their own experiences and to see each other in one another's shoes. And to co-produce these preparedness plans. Like one of our goals, right, is not only to then overcome the communication gap, but then to find out what is the most trusted form of communication? Where are people going when they're unsure of what's going to happen? Are there neighbors, friends, family that they seek the advice of? Is it a school? Is it a police department? Is it a library? Is it a social institution? Is it the Weather Channel? Is it an app? Where are people going? Where do they trust? And therefore also we can learn how can we more effectively reach people in times. And so that's one of our really big ultimate goals, is to think, okay, how can we help, say, for instance, the library, expand the ability to contact a population at a time of threat, right? At a time of hazard threat. If we were able to set up an interface, say, between the Eversource Energy Center at UConn, which has an outage prediction modeling that can send information in advance of a predicted large spread power outage. Can we get that word out that not only this is coming, but there are power sources available. There are mobile batteries available. There's a food bank available, right? If we could just get a little bit of advance warning, how does that help facilitate, right? And to your point also, and you know, one of the things I tell my students at the end of the semester when we're talking about climate change, because I try to end on solutions, right? Because I do feel like solutions are local level, right? I don't feel like they're very effective top down. I think regulation is big time top down. I think climate change, the culpability has to be top down. But the solutions are largely bottom up. And I go back to Voltaire, and I'm just saying you must cultivate your garden and just start as local as you can and care for the local, care for what's right in front of you and what you can handle. And then as you can handle more, right, get a little bigger and get a little bigger. But starting small is starting.
Right. Yeah. We have a question. How do you foster a conversation to share stories? How do you bring people affected together with those who can change things and get to the kernel of what needs to be found out about what would help?
Sometimes you can and sometimes you can't. And sometimes it means that you start by speaking to people either individually, or you gather some of their stories in a setting, perhaps it's anonymously, where they're comfortable sharing it. Because oftentimes you're not necessarily going to have community members willing to just say, oh yeah, I'll tell mine now, into a public setting, especially when there's, say, perhaps an authority figure, an official or a manager right there. But if you can start collecting experiences and kind of throwing out, hey, these types of things are experienced, right? And you can start fostering a dialogue where people will comment on what are the underlying what are the roots of why people are having these experiences, right? What is the common denominator for problems, or what is the common denominator for solutions? Then you can start building a conversation that can move towards solidifying those solutions and finding ways to avert the problem trends. But usually it doesn't happen cold turkey. It really does require sort of a slow, that's why we go from that sort of very broad brush social vulnerability to surveys, to focus groups, or to interviews, to focus groups, to get slowly that amount of information so that we're informed. It's like doing any sort of research. We need to be informed so that we can ask the questions that make people comfortable to start sharing, so that it can be a community guided solution, right? We don't have a solution that we would want to impose on anybody else, because there is no one set solution, right? It's about caring for what's in front, and addressing the needs in context to context situation.
Right. And I'm so eager to get started. I can't tell you. And I hope we've inspired some other folks in the audience. And if we have, please tell everybody you know and run into, shout it out on social media, because these are, as you said, these climate issues are not going away, and Connecticut is becoming more and more vulnerable and more affected by them. And I don't like being without power for a week at a time. It's not fun, and I'm probably able to withstand and bounce back pretty easily. It's not fun.
Yeah.
And I can't even scratch the surface of what a hellacious, horrifying thing it might be if you couldn't bounce back.
Right.
Yeah, so agreed. With that, I'd like to thank everybody. I realize we're at just after 8 o'clock. As part of our grant efforts in raising awareness of these issues, there will be 2 book discussions in May. On May 11th at 5:30, we'll discuss Elizabeth Colbert's Under a White Sky. And on May 24th at 5:30, we'll discuss Barbara Kingsolver's The Prodigal Summer. I know there's too much glare to see the book covers, but they're there. Copies of these books are available to borrow at the library. Please just send me an email, come in and grab one, and I'd love to see you at these book discussions. Finally, on June 15th at 5:30 in person, we'll host a town hall style meeting to share storm disaster experiences and ideas for building resilience and better communication in the future. Eleanor Ouimet will be there with us, and I'm very grateful for that. And I hope you'll join us. Bring your friends and neighbors, tell people, again, shout it from the rooftops, tell everybody so that the word gets around. We'll do what we can to have some food there and invite people in. And we really would like to get efforts going and coordinated to help folks, if possible, in this 2022 year of what we know are sure to be some terrible storms. Elle, thank you again so much for giving us your time and your brilliance tonight. And everybody, thank you for joining us tonight. I hope to see you at our book discussions and at the June 15th meeting and at Essex Library programs coming up in May as well. Thank you so much, everybody. Take care.
Thank you so much, Anne.